بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد سيد المرسلين إلى يوم الدين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ولا شبيه ولا مثيل له ولا ضد ولا ند ولا جسد ولا صورة ولا أعضاء له. كان الله ولا مكان فهو الآن على ما عليه كان فلا تضربوا لله الأمثال ولله المثل الأعلى. تنزه ربي عن الجلوس والقعود وعن الحركة والسكون وعن الاتصال والانفصال. لا يحل فيه شيء ولا ينحل منه شيء ولا يحل هو في شيء لأنه ليس كمثله شيء. مهما تصورت بذلك فالله لا يشبه ذلك. ومن وصف الله بمعنى من معاني البشر فقد كفر. وأشهد أن سيدنا وعظيمنا وقائدنا وقرة أعيننا محمدا عبد الله ورسوله ونبيه وصفيه وحبيبه وخليله أرسله الله هدى ورحمة للعالمين هاديا ومبشرا ونذيرا وداعيا إلى الله بإذنه سراجا وهاجا وقمرا منيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وأعظم وأنعم وأكرم على هذا النبي الكريم سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين كلما ذكره الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكره الغافلون. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا عظيم الجاه. I praise Allah, I glorify Him and I thank Him for all the blessings that He gives without Him being obligated to give anything. And I ask Allah Ta'ala to raise the rank of our beloved Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and to protect the Muslim nation. I testify that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah, the one without a partner, the one without an equal, the one without a similar, the one who is unlike anything in the universe and nothing in the universe is like Him. He has no father, no mother, no sister, no brother, no son, and no daughter. He exists without time and place because He is the creator of time and place. He does not reside above the throne and He is not attributed with fatigue like the Jews say. Our Lord is glorified beyond any imperfection that the non-Muslims attribute to Him. Whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah Ta'ala does not resemble that, and whoever attributes an attribute of the creations to Allah is outside of Islam. And I testify that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the son of Abdullah, the son of Abdul Muttalib, the son of Hashim, the son of Abdul Manaf, from the tribe of Quraysh, is the best creation of Allah and His final prophet and messenger sent to all humans and jinn. And He is truthful about everything that He conveyed in the revelation. Thereafter, we remind ourselves to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah and attending this session of Islamic knowledge, because having a sincere intention is a requirement to get the reward. So the Muslim, whenever he does a good deed, he has to have the sincere intention for the sake of Allah to get a reward for that good deed. The reward is defined as a compensation that the Muslim receives in the hereafter for the good deeds that he did in this life among what makes him happy. An example of the reward that is guaranteed to the righteous Muslim in the grave is that his grave is expanded approximately 105 feet by 105 feet, and his grave is illuminated with a light similar to the light of the full moon, and the fragrance of paradise will be present in the grave. The sincere intention means for the Muslim to do the good deed, seeking the acceptance of Allah only and not the praise of the people. So alhamdulillah, we're grateful to Allah that we have been given the guidance that Allah Ta'ala has guided us to Islam, because Islam is the greatest endowment. We are grateful to Allah that Allah Ta'ala has made our hearts pleased with the knowledge of Islam, with the creed of Islam. And we are grateful to Allah that He has granted us access to the authentic knowledge of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah, which is validated by the connected authentic chains leading back to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Because that is the only way to have credibility in Islam. The only way to have credibility in Islam is to be connected to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam through the chains of narration, through the knowledge and through the chains of narration. So nobody can have credibility in Islam claiming that they read the Quran and the Hadith on their own and they interpret it on their own. So the one who does that, the scholars of Islam said, his Imam is the Shaytan. And so he will truly not be following the Quran and the Sunnah. Following the Quran and the Sunnah means following the teachings of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And since we were not there personally during the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, so the only way for us to have the teachings of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is through the chains of narration. So we are grateful to Allah that we have been given the virtue and the merit of being among those who carry the chains. We're going to continue on with this book that we're reading called Collection of Goodness. It is basically a compilation of lessons that were given at different periods of time, at different places, by a specific scholar who passed away in the year 2008. He originates from the city of Haram, and he was born there and he died in the year 2008. So this book was compiled by his students. They basically took their handwritten notes and they compared it with each other, and then they consolidated it and they wrote it into a book. And then that book was translated from Arabic to English. So we reached to page 42. Whoever's following along, who has a physical copy of the book, whoever's following along, we're on page 42. And this lesson, we didn't finish it, we were in the middle of it. And this lesson is explaining the hadith, إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ بَدَأَ غَرِيبًا وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَاءِ الَّذِينَ يُصْلِحُونَ مَا أَفْسَدَهُ النَّاسُ مِنْ سُنَّتِي مِنْ بَعْدِي. So this hadith is a very famous hadith, and it is confirmed. The chains of this hadith are confirmed. And it's one of those hadith that we are obligated to believe in. And meaning that it's a level of certainty. It is confirmed that the Prophet ﷺ said. So we began to explain this hadith. We said, إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ بَدَأَ غَرِيبًا وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ. It means certainly the Muslims were persecuted when Islam started spreading, and Muslims will be persecuted again. So glad tidings for the strangers. Those who correct what the people have corrupted from my methodology. So this hadith, it's indicative, and it's telling us a few things. Number one, the situation of the Muslims when the Prophet ﷺ first began calling people to Islam. So as you know, all the prophets, they came with Islam. All the prophets, they came with La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah. All the prophets, they taught no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah. And so the true religion, the only accepted religion by Allah is Islam. And Prophet Jesus alayhi salam, he was the last prophet before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that was sent to this earth. So Prophet Jesus alayhi salam, when he was sent to this earth, he came with Islam and he taught the people Islam, and certain people followed him. So those people that followed him, and they were called Muslims. And so after Prophet Isa alayhi salam was raised to the second heaven, those true followers of Jesus alayhi salam, they eventually became extinct, either because they were killed or because they went astray. So there was a gap between Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam of about 500 years, where there were no true followers of Isa alayhi salam left. So then when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam received the revelation, of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam received the revelation, and he was renewing the call to Islam. So when he began to call people to Islam, the society in which he lived in was an idolatry society, a society that worships the idols, a society that is superstitious, a society that is ignorant, a society that they are tyrannical, the strong, they exploit the weak and they do injustice to the weak, and there is a certain social system, a caste system, or like a system of, if you're from this tribe, then you're better than that person, and if you're from here, then you're better than that person. So they have all of that in the society of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he started telling them, no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah, that was strange to them. They found that to be strange. And their reaction to the message of Islam, the majority of the idol worshippers and those who lived in Mecca at the time, their reaction was violent. So what happened to the Muslims when those few people that embraced Islam, when the Prophet ﷺ started calling the people to Islam, there were a few people who embraced. The first person to embrace was Lady Khadija radiallahu anha. And Abu Bakr was the first among the men, and Imam Ali was the first among the prepubescent. And so then Abu Bakr, he went out and he gave da'wah to certain people, and among the people that embraced Islam on the hand of Abu Bakr was our master Uthman radiallahu anhu. So Islam began like that, spreading individually, person to person. And a lot of the people that, or some of the people that embraced Islam were slaves. And people that were owned by other people, people that were used as servants and slaves. So when certain people embraced Islam, the masters of those servants and slaves, they reacted violently and they mistreated those slaves. So they would tie them up and they would torture them to death if they didn't leave Islam. And so that's what it means. إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ بَدْأَ غَرِيبًا. Yani it means when the Prophet ﷺ first began calling to Islam. And for 13 years while the Muslims lived in Mecca, they were persecuted. What does that mean, persecuted? That means if you walked down the street and they knew that you were Muslim, you were abused, you were verbally assaulted, you were physically assaulted. In certain cases you were killed, in certain cases you were just beat up, in certain cases you were spit on, in certain cases you're insulted. For 13 years, the Muslims, they lived like that in Mecca with the Prophet ﷺ. Even the Prophet ﷺ himself, he went through persecution as well. So his neighbors, which were among the two biggest non-Muslims, Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl, either Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl, and another one named Uqbah, they used to throw the feces on the door of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course that's a calamity, it's a tragedy, it's something that the Prophet ﷺ would be patient on, but that doesn't mean that he condones it. Because there is a false story, there's a fabricated story that some people made up, and it's a blasphemous story. They claim that there was a Jew who used to put his trash in front of the Prophet's house, alayhi salatu wasalam, and that one day the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam did not find the trash there, and that supposedly he went to visit the Jew and he asked him, how come you're not throwing trash today? And that's not true, man. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam would never encourage or condone for someone to do something sinful. A Jew throwing trash in front of the Prophet's house to bother him and to disturb him and to degrade him. Is that something good or something bad? Is something bad? Is that something praiseworthy or something that is dispraised, something dispraised? Is that a good deed or a bad deed? It's a bad deed. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not going to go and say, hey, how come you didn't come today and throw trash in front of my door? Na'udhu, this is a fabrication. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he also did endure persecution. So the meaning of the hadith is that the Muslims were persecuted when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam first started calling to Islam. وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ, which means, and the Muslims will be persecuted again, just as they were when it first began. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he said, فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَى, which is an Arabic expression to say like good news or congratulations, glad tidings to the ones who, that's their situation, and to the ones who are persecuted, and when they're persecuted again, and like in the times that we're living in now. And so one of the companions, he said, and who are these strangers? And the term that is used is al-ghuraba, which is the plural of gharib, which literally means stranger. So the companions, they said, and who are these ghuraba? And who specifically are they? Define who they are. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he said, those who correct what the people have corrupted from my methodology. So that means that after Islam, and it's going to come, but we're just recapping what we went through before. There was a time when the Muslims were persecuted, when the Prophet ﷺ first began calling to Islam, and for 13 years the Muslims were persecuted, the Muslims were harmed for being Muslim, they couldn't live freely as Muslims, and then Allah Ta'ala ordered the Muslims to migrate to Al-Madinah. And so when they migrated to Al-Madinah, then the Muslims were able to practice Islam freely and live as Muslims. And Islam began to grow, and Islam began to spread. And then the permission came for the Muslims to fight. So before the Muslims, they didn't draw their swords except in certain situations because they had yet to be given the permission to fight. But then once they moved to Al-Madinah and once they certain things were established, they were given the permission to fight. And then from that moment forward, the Muslims began to dominate and grow, etc. And they weren't persecuted anymore because now the Muslims, they're able to fight. So then, after that, 10 years after, is when the Prophet ﷺ returned to the city of Mecca, conquering it without a battle. So that's what Surah Al-Nasr is referring to. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. So this surah is referring to when the Prophet ﷺ entered Mecca after spending 10 years at Medina, and Islam had grown, and he had about 100,000 companions with him, and they entered at Medina without a fight. And the city surrendered. And the same people that had persecuted the Prophet ﷺ 23 years prior are the same people who on that day, they surrendered the city to him. And so the Prophet ﷺ, what did he do? Did he enact revenge? Did he say, oh, you were the people who were persecuting me, who were throwing feces on my door, who were insulting me, who were trying to harm me because I was spreading Islam? And now I'm able to, for example, I have power and I have authority. And what did the people expect the Prophet ﷺ to do? He asked them, and they told him, you are an honorable person, the son of an honorable person. Meaning, you are known to be noble amongst the tribe of Quraysh. And meaning, he embodies the characteristics of what they considered to be noble and virtuous, and he was generous, he was forgiving, he was pardoning, etc. So the Prophet ﷺ, he pardoned them, meaning that he didn't begin to enact his revenge. Instead, he said, so-and-so was safe, so-and-so was safe, and giving them safety and security. And then because of that, people began to embrace al-Islam in waves, in droves, in large groups. So then after that, obviously Islam dominated the Arabian Peninsula. And then after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Islam spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And Islam dominated beyond the Arabian Peninsula as far east as China and as far west as Morocco and North Africa. That was during the life of the companions, within a span of 25 years after the Prophet ﷺ died. And then continually, gradually, Islam was dominating Eastern Europe, the Far East, what's considered today to be Pakistan and Afghanistan and India, all those areas, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, all those areas dominated by the Muslims. And so the Muslims, they were dominant not only on the battlefield, but also in the sciences and in secular knowledge and in things that have to do with technology and things like that. The Muslims were advanced. And so we dominated for centuries and centuries and centuries until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so that has been about 100 years now since that happened. And so now we're in the situation that we're in now. From the time that the Ottoman Empire began to collapse until now, we see that the situation has declined and degraded and gotten worse and worse for the Muslims, to the point now where in some places you can just get killed just like that for being Muslim, and nobody will do anything about it, and nobody will arrest anyone, and nobody will be taken to court, nobody will be indicted or anything like that. And they'll film it and they'll put it on social media and they'll put it on TV, and nobody will stop it. Nobody will do anything about it. There will be no United Nations, there will be no international police, there will be no anything. It'll just be people protesting, people yelling, people screaming, people showing that they're against it, but no action being taken. The murder will still occur, and nobody can stop it. Babies and kids and women getting killed, and nobody's doing anything. Nobody is even blinking at it. These people that claim that they want peace and that they claim to uphold justice in the world are turning a blind eye. So that persecution, and that's something that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about. Obviously now it's at a more severe scale, but it's been happening for decades. The Muslims have been persecuted in Burma. The Rohingya Muslims, they've been persecuted, skinned alive, burned in trenches. That's been happening for probably over a decade now. The Uyghur Muslims that have been in concentration camps in China for over more than a decade. I remember maybe like in 2014, 2015, there was a journalist that came here asking questions about that. So that's been happening. And countries like Iraq and countries like Afghanistan, since like 2003, it's been happening. So that persecution, the Prophet ﷺ spoke about it. And he indicated part of the reason for that persecution to happen, which is that people, after the Prophet ﷺ, they have corrupted certain things from the way of the Prophet ﷺ, pertaining to the creed. And so things spiraled out of control, things went downhill. Because the core of our strength as Muslims, or as a Muslim nation, it rests in our piety. So the more pious that we are, or if we are actually pious, then we'll be undefeated, we'll be unstoppable, and we would physically conquer. And there's no way to be pious while being ignorant of the personal obligatory knowledge of Islam. So nowadays you have people that claim to be Muslim, and they can't even tell you, for example, what are the integrals of wudu? What are the things that if you leave them out, the wudu won't be valid? What are the conditions for the wudu to be valid? Nowadays, there's just many people that are ignorant. So, that's what it means. إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ بَدَأَ غَرِيبًا وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَاءِ. And so the Shaykh was explaining this. He was mentioning about the persecution, and he was telling the story about those three Muslims, the first martyrs in Islam, and from this nation. They were a family, a mother, a father, and a son. The mother, her name was Sumayya. The father's name was Yasir, and the son, his name was Ahmad. So the non-Muslims, they tied him up, and they told the father, for example, say blasphemy, praise our idols, and he refused, and they killed him. And then for the mother, they told her to praise the idols, and she stood in their face, and so they tore her apart literally. They tied two camels to her feet and had the camels run in opposite directions, and they stabbed her private part with a spear, and she was killed. Now for the son Ahmad, he, in order to save himself, he said the words that they wanted him to say. And so Allah Ta'ala, He revealed about that situation, about that case, that if a Muslim is under the threat of death, and he says the words that the non-Muslim wants him to say, as long as his heart is not pleased with the words that he's saying, then he is not judged as a blasphemer. And if, when the non-Muslim is forcing the Muslim to say those words, if the Muslim, when he says it, his heart becomes pleased with those words, then he exits from Islam. This is the judgment that's mentioned in the ayah. مَنْ كَفَرَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِيمَانِهِ إِلَّا مَنْ أُكْرِهَ وَقَلْبُهُ مُطْمَئِنٌّ بِالْإِيمَانِ ولكن من شرح بالكفر صدرا فعليهم غضب من الله ولهم عذاب عظيم. Excuse me. This verse means whoever commits kufr after having been Muslim, except those who are forced under the threat of death while their hearts are firm on Islam. However, anyone who is pleased with kufr, then they will have severe torture. That is the judgment that is mentioned in that verse. And so the Shaykh here is saying and explaining that the situation of being threatened with death, like if a Muslim is threatened with death, only in that situation do we check the intention of his heart. Was he happy with what he said, or was he not happy with it? Was he pleased with it, or was he not pleased with it? Did he believe it, or did he not believe it? Did he hate it, or did he not hate it? Only in the case of under the threat of death do we check that. But other than the case of the threat of death, then we don't check that. If a Muslim, he says a blasphemous statement while knowing what it means and voluntarily and not under the threat of death, we don't ask him, did you feel good when you said it? Did you feel happy when you said that? So that's not the criteria by which to judge when it's other than the threat of death. Someone online asked, what about other harm other than death? No, for other harm other than death, then the Muslim is not excused. So the exception is only made when the Muslim is under the threat of death, or what leads to death. So, but for example, if they threaten the Muslim with taking all his money, then that's not, he cannot, say blasphemy and be excused. They threatened to put him in jail for a long time. He can't say blasphemy. It's only under the threat of death that the person may, that the Muslim, in order to save his life, he may say the words that the non-Muslims want him to say, with the condition that he hates it in his heart. So the main point here is that when do we take the condition of being pleased with what you're saying or not being pleased? We only take that into consideration when the Muslim is under the threat of death. Other than that situation, we don't take that into consideration. So continuing on, and that was just a recap, continuing on, the author said, we're on page 42, right in the middle of the page. What is learned from this case is that the blasphemy saying might be independent of an intention and a belief, and likewise the blasphemous action. It might be independent, And blasphemy would be confirmed by the action itself, even if it was not combined with an intention, and likewise the blasphemous belief. Blasphemy is confirmed by it, even if it was not accompanied with a saying or an action. So whoever was ignorant about this and denied the categorization of blasphemy into three categories, then he is among the most ignorant of God's creations about Islam, and he has no credibility in that Islam. And what the Shaykh is saying is that if a Muslim, if he says something that's blasphemy, then that's sufficient for him to exit from Islam. It doesn't have to be that he says something blasphemy while believing it. So just by him saying the words and understanding them, of course, and saying it voluntarily, that's enough for him to be judged as an apostate. And if the Muslim, for example, he does an action that is blasphemous, that is enough for him to be judged as an apostate. And if he has a blasphemous belief, that's enough for him to be judged as an apostate. It doesn't have to be a blasphemous statement along with a blasphemous creed, along with a blasphemous action. And so because the scholars of Islam, the Islamic law, they talked about the three categories of blasphemy. They said some blasphemy, it occurs with the tongue, some blasphemy occurs with the heart, some blasphemy occurs with the body parts. So the Shaykh continues to say, a person in this country, and in the country that he was living in, denied the categorization of blasphemy into three categories. And so this person, in reality, it is as if he exposed his own deep ignorance, and it is as if he has announced to the people, "O people, I know I am ignorant about Islam, so do not be misled by this person because of him being articulate. What matters is not if the person is talking a lot. Rather, what matters is agreeing with the truth. Just as the Prophet ﷺ said, articulation is not by wordy speech. Rather, the true articulation is speaking the truth. And it is not a flaw to not talk too much. Rather, to not talk much. It is not a flaw to not talk much. And some people think if you don't talk a lot, that something's wrong with you. They think that if you don't talk a lot, that you're dumb, which is very, very strange. So the Prophet ﷺ, he advised the Muslims to observe lengthy silence except from goodness. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, لَيْسَ الْبَيَانُ كَثْرَةَ الْكَلَامِ لكن البيان إصابة الحق وليس العي قلة الكلام إنما العي من سفه الحق. So this means O people, this means articulation is not by wordy speech. Rather, the true articulation is speaking the truth. And it is not a flaw to not talk much. Rather, the flawed one is the one who misses the truth and strays from it. And it's not about the amount of words that you say, it's about the content of your words. Are you speaking the truth? Then that's what's considered articulation, and the praise articulation. The Shaykh continued to say, therefore don't be misled if a man is articulate, because articulation is of two types. One type is articulating the truth in compliance with the religion of Islam, and another type of articulation is used to entice the hearts of the people, decorating the words to make people think it is the truth while it is not the truth. That is the meaning of the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated by Ibn Hibban in his Sahih, إِنَّ مِنَ الْبَيَانِ لَسِحْرًا, which means indeed some expressions are sorcery. So yeah, there's some people that they know how to speak and they know how to get the crowd riled up and they know how to work a crowd and they know how to be impactful with their words, but they're misguided. So they use that talent, for example, they use that ability that they have to misguide people. So that person, obviously, he is dispraised. The Shaykh said, we return to the explanation of the hadith. Indeed, Muslims were persecuted when Islam began spreading. The meaning of persecution of Islam at the beginning, when the Prophet ﷺ received the revelation, is that the Muslims were persecuted by the non-Muslims when the Prophet ﷺ first received the revelation. And they continued to be persecuted until the Prophet ﷺ migrated by the will of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ was harmed a lot. He was hit by the hands of the non-Muslims to the extent that in some cases he became unconscious. As for his companions, the calamity on them was very severe. Ahmad, the son of Yasir, his mother, was murdered by Abu Jahl because she became a Muslim. He stabbed her private part with a spear. Likewise, Yasir, the father of Ahmad, may Allah accept their good deeds, was harmed a lot by the non-Muslims and they killed him. The bottom line is that the Muslims were persecuted when the Prophet ﷺ first received the revelation. Some of that persecution was through actions and some of it was through words, like insults and degrading. Then after the immigration, the Muslims became strong and the Prophet did not stop ﷺ until the Arabian Peninsula was open to Islam with its vast area. The Prophet ﷺ informed that this persecution will happen again after Islam goes through a dominant stage and spreads. Now in our times, this persecution has been confirmed. Don't you see that the one who speaks the truth, which complies with the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is persecuted and insulted and harmed and is called a fool? Like what occurs to the one who judges as a kafir, whoever cusses Allah, whether in a state of anger or joking. And so in some countries, the Muslims or some people in those countries, when they would get mad, they would curse Allah. And they didn't know that this takes them out of Islam. So when a person heard them say that, they told them, "A'udhu billah, how could you curse Allah? This say your shahada, you have to come back to Islam." They would tell him, "You're a fool." They would tell him, like, "What are you talking about?" They would tell him, like, "Who are you?" And he was just trying to help them. Indeed, many people object to him and reject the truth that cussing Allah is kufr during a state of seriousness, joking, or anger. Likewise, their objection to leaving out for the man to shake hands with a marriageable woman, even though the Prophet ﷺ and his companions and whoever followed them did not shake hands with marriageable women at all. No one ever said it was permissible. So the Prophet ﷺ himself and those who followed the Prophet ﷺ and those who followed the companions of the Prophet ﷺ completely, they did not shake hands with marriageable women at all. No one ever said it was permissible, whether it was seeking pleasure or for any other reason. Some people in Beirut have been harmed because they did not agree to fasting Ramadan relying on the calculations of the astronomer. The consensus of the scholars of Islam has confirmed that the calculations of the astronomer are not relied upon for the fasting of Ramadan because the Prophet ﷺ conveyed a revealed rule and said what means "Sumu li ru'yatihi wa aftiru li ru'yatihi." And the Prophet ﷺ was explicit about how we are to determine the beginning of Ramadan. فَإِنْ غُمَّ عَلَيْكُمْ فَأَكْمِلُوا عِدَّةَ شَعْبَانَ 30. Which means fast. You are ordered to fast if you see the crescent. And you are ordered to break the fast when you see it. The crescent. And if you are blocked from seeing the crescent, then complete the 30 days of Sha'ban. So this is what the Prophet ﷺ told us to do. Our community adhered to this hadith, and they did not agree with those who relied on the calculations of the astronomers for the fasting of Ramadan. And therefore they were harmed for that, a severe harm, even from the likes of those who wear the turbans, even though what they studied in their formal education is that fasting is not confirmed by the saying of the astronomer. There are many other examples about how the Muslims who are adhering to the religion of Islam are persecuted. As for the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, good news for the strangers, the Prophet ﷺ himself explained when he said, "Those who correct what the people have corrupted from my methodology after me. Therefore we, alhamdulillah, revive the methodology of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We order ourselves and others to adhere to what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came with. Whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam deemed obligatory, we deem obligatory. And whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam deemed prohibited upon his nation, we deem it prohibited. And whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraged his nation to do, without deeming it an obligation upon them, we deem it as such. And we thank Allah for that, and we ask Allah to keep us steadfast on this path, and to grant us patience with those who take us as enemies because of their misguidance. Allah Ta'ala knows best. And we will end there. That's the end of lesson 6. Next week, inshallah, we'll continue with lesson 7, which is titled, Allah Ta'ala is not attributed with a boundary. What does that mean? That means that Allah Ta'ala, He's not a body. He is not a quantity. He is not something that can be measured, or something that has a length, or something that has a width, or something that has a depth. Because measurements only apply to creations. And if there are no questions, we'll conclude. طيب نهلل لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات وبارك الله فيكم السلام عليكم